You to the second DCC workshop of the spring semester and the sixth of the academic year. For those of you who don't know, and for the sake of our speaker tonight, I want to say a little bit about the program itself, starting with DCC itself. The program is in its ninth year, and the formal title is the Penn Program on Democracy, Constitutionalism, and Citizenship, as most of you know. It was originally founded and funded through a $2.5 million grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to the School of Arts and Sciences, and later supplemented by the Mary and Daniel Boyce, I might be mispronouncing that, Family Fund. The DCC program has four major components. The DCC Postdoctoral Fellowship, which is awarded each year to a scholar in any discipline who's received a doctorate within the last 5 years and is doing research pertinent to the annual theme of the fellowship. This year, the postdoc who's filling that role from the anthropology department of Stanford, named Lisa Poggiali. Is this here? Yeah, great. And Lisa. The second component is 3 DCC graduate fellowships, which are awarded each year to post-prospectus Penn graduate students whose research is pertinent to the larger theme of democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism. The third leg of the DCC program are 10 DCC undergraduate research grants, which are awarded each spring to the undergraduates for research projects related to the themes of democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism. And then last of these four major components, but certainly most relevant for today, is the series of workshops that take place every year that include a keynote address at the beginning, faculty workshop series, and then a spring conference which brings together leading scholars from around the world to present papers on aspects of an annual theme chosen by the Penn faculty. Prior yearly themes have included citizenship, borders, and human needs, civic representation, elections, and public opinion, sovereignty, territoriality, and plural citizenships, race, ethnicity, national minorities, and citizenship, corporations and citizens, constitution making, social rights, and citizenship, and then last year, post-neoliberal Latin America. This year's theme is, as you know, digital media and the futures of democracy. I want to thank the committee that worked on putting the series together. First and foremost, to Roger Smith, who is the DCC director and who participated in the decision making, and Matt Roth, the DCC coordinator, and the DCC executive committee and members of this year's planning committee, which includes Sandra Gonzalez-Pelon, David Grazian, Jeffrey Green, and Christopher Yu. In this series, we've been exploring, discussing, and assessing the complex impact of the radically evolving media landscape on democratic politics, as well as on the closely related issues of citizenship and constitutional government, both in the United States and around the globe. Over the year, we've had a keynote address by Harvard Law professor and former head of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, Cass Sunstein. We've had a paper presented by University of Washington, Central European University, and Oxford sociologist and communications scholar Philip Howard. We've had a paper by University of Arizona sociologist Jennifer Earle on young people and the use of online sources for political engagement. A talk by another Harvard Law professor, Yochai Benkler, on the network public sphere. A talk by UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara communications scholar Kelly Gates on the use of big data and state transparency as it applies to information about police killings. And a talk last month by New York University's Tandon School of Engineering professor and former White House Deputy Chief Technology Officer Beth Novick on crowdsourcing smartly. We continue our explorations of these issues with today's speaker and discussant. We're very fortunate to have with us Professor Helen Nissenbaum, whose talk, timely, as I was mentioning to her before, given the current controversy between Apple and the FBI and the courts. The paper is entitled, Must Privacy Give Way to Use Regulations? And which was distributed to you all last week. Helen, in my mind, epitomizes the interdisciplinarity that is at the heart of these DCC workshops. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Stanford University, is professor of media, culture, and communication and of computer science at New York University, where she's also director of the Information Law Institute. Her work spans social, ethical, and political dimensions of information technology and digital media. She has written and edited 8 books, including Privacy, Big Data, and the Public Good, Frameworks for Engagement, Values at Play in Digital Games, and Privacy in Context, Technology, Policy, and the Integrity of Social Life. Her research publications have appeared in journals of philosophy, politics, law, media studies, information studies, and computer science. I'm also happy to say that she was a visiting scholar at the Annenberg School in 2012. Serving as discussant today is Chloe Bacalar. Chloe is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Human Values at Princeton University. She's a political and legal theorist with an empirical background in American politics. Her research focuses on questions of democratic theory, the history of modern political thought, and public law. She's currently working on a book manuscript tentatively entitled Small Talk, The Impact of Social Speech on Liberal Democratic Citizenship, that considers and maps the positive and negative effects of everyday talk on liberal democratic citizenship and political outcomes. Bacalar holds an MA and PhD in political science from this university. We've worked with Rogers while she was here. I'm not sure about that. My mistake. She's also affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson School Center for the Study of Democratic Politics. So the format will be as usual. Begin with hoping that most of you have read the paper. We'll then move to a brief presentation by Helen summarizing the major themes of the paper, then turn to our discussant, and then we'll open it up to what I hope will be a lot of discussion about these very important and timely issues. So please join me in welcoming Helen Nissenbaum.
Oh, sorry. My notes are there. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to have my work scrutinized by this amazing gathering. And just to give you incontrovertible evidence that this is thoroughly work in progress, I left so many typos in the document. I hope you noticed them. I was so embarrassed when I read it today. But anyway, it's really excellent. And what I thought I would do in my remarks, just to introduce a little bit about this work, not necessarily, I mean, I might go through some of the arguments. I haven't completely decided, but I wanted to just explain a little bit why I'm writing this paper. Why, when I was invited to have this opportunity to write something new and present work in progress, I had been thinking about this use versus collection regulation issue because I had been noticing at multiple venues that I would go to, it would be in legal venues, or I would go to the NSF, or I would go to the NSA. I was recently participating in a privacy, hold the skepticism that it was a privacy workshop that we held there, and a lot in the computer science communities too, people who say things like, just collection is, that's water under the bridge, and the horse is out of the barn and all of that. There's no hope for that, let's just regulate the use. And I hear that again and again. And what happened was, at first, well, there was this concern that this was a little bit continuous with two kinds of privacy skeptics. One, which I introduced in the article, which is the bad boy argument, I'm not sure if that was such a good term, but it just popped into my head, of these people who, way back, way before big data, were arguing, oh, privacy's dead, get over it, and so on, even as information technology was emerging. And then you had the skeptics who were like Richard Posner, and I would put Jane Yakovitz in that argument, in that category, who say things like, when you look at privacy and you imagine that privacy is conflicting with a myriad other goods, let's perform this kind of cost benefit and we must conclude that privacy is over and it hardly ever outweighs some of the other benefits that we get from the freedom for data flow. But having worked with Solomon Barocas on the article that's called End Run Around Anonymity and Consent, and having arrived at the conclusion, and that was really in relation to some of the characteristics of what I'm using always, whenever I say big data, it's like big data, because it's really, big data is kind of a mindset, it's a paradigm, it's not any particular technology. So sometimes I'll use, in this paper I talk about data science instead, because I don't like the term big data very much, but sometimes you're stuck with it. But what we argued in that paper was there's always been a threat to privacy from digital technologies for a whole bunch of reasons, and some of this I discuss in Privacy in Context, but there's some very interesting reasons why certain approaches to protecting privacy, one which is anonymization, and what that does is it will take a database, so the theory goes, outside the remit of privacy to say, okay, once we've anonymized effectively, we can just put the data out there, and that can be very useful. And so the fact that there have been all these problems with anonymization and big data actually not only makes the problems more serious, but actually impossible to resolve. And the same with informed consent, which is really the backbone of EU regulation of privacy, and significantly also the US, although we do things differently. Informed consent is really fundamental to that. And what we argue, a similar kind of argument, is not only is it difficult to get informed consent in light of big data, but actually big data does this end run. And so then we arrive at this question, well, what do we do about it? And all those people, these skeptics, say, yeah, you finally seen the light. Just give up privacy, or give up connection, because, and of course I was sort of for a moment horrified and push back and say, well, this is only about means and not ends, and so I've always thought that informed consent was problematic, and this just reinforces the view. And that's when I felt now it becomes critical to examine this argument that is now being pushed from all sides, saying we have to give up on collection regulation because we simply cannot. And let's focus all of our attention on use. And I'll give you an example, use your data to cure disease, and just so many of these things which we can do so much, we don't know in advance what the benefits of the data is, and so any kind of regulation that will stop flow might prevent the achievement of these benefits. So, and then of course on the downside, we have a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that certain companies are using big data or data analytics to predict which candidates for a position is more likely to become ill. And there we might say, a little bit of a problem over there. And so the use versus connection folks are saying, yeah, that's what we mean. You know, we need to regulate use. That's the way to go. We look at those applications, we say, no, that's problematic. We look at these applications and we say, that's great, and that's precisely what we want the data for. And what I do in the paper is scrutinize this argument. First, to clarify some of the terms, because although everybody sounds like they're saying the same thing, the terms of use and collection are actually used differently by different parties. Second of all, sometimes the argument is a descriptive argument to say it's impossible, and other times the argument is a normative one saying we should not because we would lose out. And so what is it? And then depending on whether you're descriptive or normative, I further scrutinize those arguments to say, do they hold up? Is it the case, whether you go for the descriptive or the normative or both, can we conclude that the time has come to give up on collection regulation and focus on use regulation? And I argue in the paper that we dare not do that. And come at it from a variety of different perspectives. One point, it's cynical, which is that many of the largest collectors of data are what we're calling data intermediaries. Let's say Google or Facebook, where we might be interacting. I could be sending you Gmail, I'm doing a search or whatever, and then these intermediaries are platforms on which I'm performing those activities. There's an enormous concentration of data in the hands of the intermediaries. And I should say that the cynical part is that, in fact, we have virtually no capability of collection regulation. Truth of the matter is, this thing that everybody is saying is probably close to a reality. And so if we succeed in saying let's just forget about collection regulation, we're in fact endorsing a status quo. And I think it's problematic. I think it's important for us to scrutinize the argument. And just the last thing I'll say, and have I been talking for 10 minutes or even more?
Just about 10 minutes.
Okay. All right, so there were various bottom line arguments that I was trying to make, pushing back against the normative claims of it's a bad idea to prevent collection or restrict collection because of the benefits that could accrue, and now we're restricting those benefits. And some of the arguments, for example, there's the section on who is we, which is we are the data subjects, but are we the beneficiaries? And I think we need to scrutinize that argument. But the argument that I arrive at that is intuitively, I feel so, and I use the word feel advisedly because I'm not yet sure I know how to develop this argument. And I felt like in a political science environment, I might, get some help about this. And that is the mere collection, the knowledge, or just the having of the data is in itself a problem. So many people will say the problem is in the use, it's not in the collection. And it felt to me that there's a problem merely with the collection. And I've tried to put my finger on it by looking at Philip Pettin's ideas on republicanism, and I always think of those movies where the underdog goes to the bad guys and says, if you kill me, I've deposited this incriminating evidence about you in a bank deposit, and so-and-so has a key, and so if I'm dead, this information is going to be revealed. There's something about the having of the knowledge, the having of the information that is powerful even in and of itself. And That's a part of the argument I'm still trying to work on. As for recommendations, you saw that section hasn't been written yet.
First, I just want to very quickly thank you for brought me back to 10K, so Rogers and Michael and Greg and Matt. Most importantly, though, I'd like to thank Professor Nissenbaum for this provocative and very interesting contribution to the online privacy debate. So the paper begins, as she explains, by laying out a powerful argument for how personal information should be managed in the digital age. Namely, that rather than trying to halt the inevitable collection and storage of data, we should instead focus on regulating the ways that personal data gets used. Extreme proponents of this viewpoint claim that privacy is an antiquated concept in today's virtual landscapes, one that either cannot be maintained or would be better off discarded. And that the best we can hope for is a slate of policies policed by data ethicists that protect personal information from being abused. This bad boy image of the net as a wild west, where the free exchange of ideas and information is limited only by technological capacities, is probably overblown, however. Today, as Professor Nissenbaum points out, many of the major players in digital privacy discourse acknowledge privacy as a value worth protecting, at least as a balancing interest. This includes many who benefit greatly from the commodification of personal information. As recently as yesterday, for example, we had Apple CEO Tim Cook produce a virtual treatise on the importance of privacy, emphasizing his company's determination to keep personal information encrypted, despite efforts by the FBI to force him to make it more accessible. Of course, admitting that privacy is an important value doesn't mean that technocrats are willing to give up the data that they've collected or their ability to do so. In fact, proponents of this view often argue that regulation of data collection is simply out of the question at this point in history. They make a kind of technological determinism argument that not only are systems designed so that data collection is inherent to their proper functioning, but it couldn't have been done any other way. And now there's no turning back. You can't get the cat back in the bag, or the toothpaste back in the tube, or whatever you say. Furthermore, even if we could roll back data collection, it's argued that that would be a bad thing, depriving us all of significant social goods. Or to quote Dave Eggers' book, The Circle, these days, privacy is theft. And indeed, Cook's public statement didn't even mention the possibility that we might stymie government overreaches for access to personal information by limiting the collection of that data in the first instance, or its continued storage. Instead, Cook, like many big data exceptionalists, framed the issue as a question of how data should be used and who ought to control it. Specifically, he explained that it would be wrong to create a backdoor to the iPhone and the FBI, and no one else is following this, even if they assured him that it would only be used in this one instance. His reasoning was at least in part because once that capability exists, there won't be any way to ensure that it won't be used again. Note that he could have applied this same logic to data collection. Once the data is there, there's no way to ensure that it will always be safeguarded. But he didn't say that. He only said that we need to protect data against misuse, specifically misuse by government agents and agencies. But while plenty of people would agree that it's important to protect personal data from improper use, this approach doesn't fully square with the way that most Americans understand the concept of privacy. According to a 2015 Pew survey, a majority of Americans believe it is important or very important that they be able to maintain privacy in their everyday activities, both online and offline. So at least in that sense, it's hard to say that privacy as a value is really dead, and that's no small thing. But it's also important to understand that individuals conceive of privacy as more than just the ability to protect their personal information from uses that violate their wants, needs, and preferences. The protection of privacy for most people isn't just about control over how their personal information is used. It's also about having control over what data is collected about them and by whom. According to that same survey, 93% of Americans believe that being in control of who can collect information about them is important. And 74% feel that this is very important. Similarly, 90% of respondents said that controlling what information is collected about them is important, with 65% saying it is very important. We see this attitude also reflected in the way that Americans try, often feebly, to protect their personal information online. They always work at the point of collection. In a previous Pew study from 2014, 59% of respondents reported clearing cookies or browser histories. 57% refused to provide personal information irrelevant to the current transaction. 25% used a temporary username or email address, and 24% provided false or misleading personal information. What these acts have in common is that they're all efforts to subvert data collection. So what should we make of all this? To the extent that the public still places a high value on privacy, especially understood as control over personal data collection, we need to be skeptical of efforts to limit the scope of privacy protection to use, especially when those arguments come from those most likely to directly benefit from such an approach. In other words, where public policies so clearly clash with the democratic will, red flags should be raised and efforts should be made to reconcile the two. And that's what I take to be the major contribution of this paper, developing a scheme for bringing data science in line with public values that still consider privacy a thing worth trying to protect at the point of collection, even online. It's not just that an approach to regulation that encompasses data collection may best serve the public interest or protect against domination, which is what Professor Nissenbaum highlights in her paper. These are both excellent goals, by the way, but such an approach also validates the democratic experience of privacy, and that's a thing that should be lauded, especially in a policy area that deeply affects the lives of everyday citizens, but where their voices are so often drowned out by technical jargon and barriers. So as you can tell at this point, I'm overall pretty sympathetic to the arguments made in this paper. There are just a couple of points I want to discuss regarding areas where I think the paper might benefit from some clarification or explanation. And I'm going to start with the issue of consent, which might be a problem after that. So the issue of consent here, it seems to persist in the background of this argument, but is somewhat removed from the paper itself, for obvious reasons, I guess. Part of that is because Professor Nissenbaum makes a point at the beginning of trying to distinguish privacy, understood as appropriate flow of information, from consent, understood as privacy's gatekeeper. According to the contextual integrity approach, each online social context is imbued with unique social practices and norms based on the interaction of contexts, actors, attributes, or information types, and transmission principles that determine how it should be managed. And consent is just one possible transmission principle for satisfying privacy concerns online. In some instances, informed choice may be sufficient to ensure privacy, and presumably, in some cases, it might not require it at all. Now, it may be true that privacy doesn't always require consent, but consent does seem like it would be necessary to privacy in at least most instances. At least privacy as commonly understood. Going back to Pew, 88% of Americans believe their consent is important in determining the appropriate contours of privacy. Indeed, what does the appropriate portion of appropriate flow of information mean in most instances, if not, at least in part, that an individual did consent or would have consented to that particular flow? And so while I agree that privacy and consent are distinct concepts, I think it's still useful to talk about them in relation to each other, especially when we're trying to decide on regulations that would protect privacy as it's ordinarily understood. When we're talking about what it's right to do with people's personal information within a given set of online activities, we need to ask what they would be comfortable giving up. In other words, what would they consent to? But first, we need to scrutinize the claim that an individual actually can consent to the collection of her personal data in a given instance online. Early in the paper, we encounter a statement by Craig Mundy of Microsoft in which he claims that every day people knowingly provide enormous amounts of data. And certainly, sometimes it's true that people give away their information freely and willingly online. But a great deal of online data collection happens passively or semi-passively. Individuals may accept terms of service agreements or pass over a disclaimer. This kind of consent may be less of a choice than it appears. Even an explicit choice might not be a real choice. For it to be a real choice, there needs to be a real option for an opt-out. either in the sense of saying no to the transmission of data or saying no to the technology itself. Unfortunately, many technologies have become necessary for participation in the modern economy, and so we can't always really say no. As an example, let's say that I don't want to consent to geo-tracking, meaning I don't want my every step and location to be recorded. And let's say that I feel that way not because of any real worry about what would happen to my information and how it would be used, but because constant surveillance offends my sense of autonomy and individuality. I feel less human when I think of myself as being reduced to a set of data points, and I worry about how datafication might affect the way that I relate to others. In that case, the moral problem is clearly at the point of collection. So now I have two options available. I can choose not to carry a cell phone, or I can choose to remove the battery from my cell phone, which, as any clumsy person has tried to do on an iPhone can attest, it's not the easiest thing. And you can say that those are choices I can make, that my loss there is minimal. I'm merely giving up a technology that, as recently as 2 decades ago, most people were perfectly fine without. Sure, I'd be inconvenienced by the inability to get instant directions when I'm lost or call for help when I'm in trouble. That's a fair trade-off for choosing privacy over other concerns. Then again, the lack of payphones these days would seem to attest to just how much daily cell phones have become. They're not just phones after all. They've become nearly essential aspects of modern economic life. Today's workers are expected to be available to their employers, coworkers, and clients at all times. They're expected to be connected, to check their emails and social media constantly for up-to-the-minute information. This is true even within academia. Without a mobile device, or one that I keep off, I cut myself off from the world in ways that are no longer professionally acceptable. Note also that this kind of isolation isn't really viable in any personal sense either, as our social and private relationships online have become increasingly relevant to our online selves. And so, to choose not to carry a cell phone is to limit my opportunities in life in a very real way, and most of us can't choose to do that. Many of us don't even know to choose it. Big data is remarkably opaque to laymen, as Professor Nissenbaum points out. Sticking with the geo-tracking example, plenty of people don't realize that their mobile devices monitor and record their movements even when they're turned off. And even when we know that we're online, we may not realize what that means. We may think we're doing something private and self-regarding, editing a family photo album, for example. But what we're really doing is pumping out data in a process that's invisible to us. Under these conditions, it's hard to say that I've actually consented to very much. It's hard to say that I'm not actually being coerced into giving away my data. And if that's true, it's wrong to say that I'm giving anything away at all. Rather, personal information is being taken from me as part of an information flow that I have not deemed appropriate. Of course, I might have deemed it appropriate if it had been given to me as a real choice. For example, if it made my life easier, or if I knew that that information would serve significant social goods, but I wasn't given that choice. And that's the part that matters. So if you'll all grant me that I don't have a real choice to not use these products, and therefore I can't really be said to have consented to the data that's transmitted about me by virtue of having used them, then we have an even stronger case for robust regulation. Importantly, such regulation must take place at the point of collection if it's to have any real impact. And of course also if it's going to reflect popular conceptions of privacy. Consent at the point of use just isn't that meaningful, I'm afraid. Once my data has already been taken from me, it isn't really mine anymore. It's out of my hands. And those who do possess it can't be counted on to respect consent to use agreements. Section 9 of the law. So the only point at which I can exert any real power as a private citizen is at collection. It's also the only point where I can truly work to limit domination by those entities that would take my data, since, as Professor Nissenbaum points out, citing Phil Pettit, it's not the act of misusing my data that establishes domination, but the power or the capacity to use that information arbitrarily. So just holding that data puts them in a dominating position over me, even if they never use it or only do so for good. And it would seem that large international private corporate entities realize this, even as we often don't. These global actors recognize the value of the commodity they deal in, information, and understand that as it becomes more valuable, they become more powerful. This is evident astounded in the vehemence with which they tried to retain their stores and access to the information. If we're ever going to be able to rein their power in, personal information either has to be made entirely public so that nobody owns it unless it has no value, or we need to limit collection. In the interest of respecting the will of the public that still thinks privacy is something worth saving, I vote we choose the latter, and I vote that we do so by insisting upon some sort of consent on collection. Now, I think that a regulatory system that generally requires consent at the point of collection, providing real opt-out, can be consistent with contextual integrity, as I understand it. As long as I acknowledge that consent requirements might vary somewhat in accordance with the corresponding offline protocols, norms, and principles. Although again, I would say that I think consent would play a major role in pretty much all instances. But to say that regulation should generally include opt-outs at the point of collection is certainly not sufficient. I suspect from Professor Nissenbaum's previous work that she would agree that opt-outs are not enough regulation to protect privacy interests in many instances. And she might add that they're not always even necessary. Unfortunately, from this paper, I'm not sure that I can determine what she thinks would be the right kind of collection regulation in a particular instance. So my second major point, and this is a much shorter one than the first one, is that I'd like to know more about what Professor Nissenbaum thinks regulation would or should look like in a system that understands privacy as contextual integrity. It's not mere regulation of use that can withstand scrutiny by data ethicists, obviously. But what does she think regulation of data collection should look like? What do policymakers need to do to ensure that privacy is meaningfully protected online? Is there actually anything we can do? I suspect that all this will be very hard work, especially in terms of parsing out online flows and determining their real-world analogs, given that it's difficult to distinguish between collection and use activities. But I think it's work worth doing, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with. But in any event, I still agree with Professor Nissenbaum's general approach towards protecting our online privacy as it's commonly understood, not just as control over how information is used, but also how and by whom it is collected. And I think this is an extremely important contribution to the debate, in which one side, the data collectors and those who benefit from them, are already in a deeply entrenched and powerful position vis-a-vis a public that is increasingly attached to and dependent on a technological infrastructure designed to capture and hold on to data, while still remaining more or less illiterate concerning the actual workings of those technologies. And so I thank Professor Nissenbaum for elucidating this set of issues and helping us move towards a system of regulation that satisfies everyday understandings of privacy and data.
Helen, I've given you a chance if you'd like to respond, comment on, and what you just heard, and I suppose if you have any thoughts on reactions to that.
Those are just such great comments. Thank you so much. There's just many things that I would like to respond to, but I want to explain a little bit about why, from the perspective of contextual integrity, I put consent, give it a very limited role. And it may have to do with maybe different meanings of consent, the different ways we use consent. And so when, and as a philosopher, I'm mindful of terms like when you do something voluntarily, and what does that really entail? When, even in an object situation, I think the EU now prompts, like if you'll go to a company that has a that is a European company that's operating in the US, up will pop this dialog box that says, by the way, we're placing cookies on your browser, so, click OK if you're okay with that. So this is better than just this implicit consent that, well, you've now passed through the gates, so you now accept in terms of use. This is a more explicit consent. But even so, when I click consent, and there's this cookie exchange and maybe some collection of information, I don't want to go into all the details, you may ask the question of, have you actually consented? Have you met the requirements of consent? So I was always, I don't even know which philosopher came up with this example, but let's say you're very thirsty and you walk past a stream and you bend down to drink the water. And you could say, I'm voluntarily drinking, but assuming the stream is highly contaminated and this is toxic water and it's going to kill me. So I bend down to drink it. Do we say I'm voluntarily drinking toxic water? And the answer is no, I don't think we would say that. There's something about that. So when I start taking my steps back, and I'm not only, by the way, talking about the online environment, but in many of these environments, although you might say in some ideal universe where consent is truly consent, where those of us who are kind of pedantic about those kinds of definitions would say, those of us who are pedantic, you just can't be pedantic, because the flows of information are so complex, and Joe Turo at Annenberg is an expert in this area, in the whole, that kind of consent that might then allow for us to say my privacy has been respected, it's just not possible. So let's assume that's the case. In the same way as many we have. So what I would like to put in, what contextual integrity wants to recommend is substantive constraints on information flow. But what are the principles that legitimate one set of flows rather than some other set of flows? Now the theory of contextual integrity says we do this layered analysis that includes interests and values and contextual values, and I mean it would take quite a long time to elaborate, but the bottom line is now we're a little bit into rationale for general regulation. So it may be that as a society we could decide that 60 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour is a good speed limit, and some individual might be angry because they want to really drive at 80 miles an hour. But as a society, we think that 60 miles an hour on a highway is a better idea. Can you say each time you're abiding by that speed limit that you have consented to that speed limit? And what contextual integrity wants to say is that if you've done the analysis of particular information flows, even though it doesn't have the effect of like click yes, if you're willing to broaden your definition of consent to rules, like you're in a court of law and you're a witness and the judge, or no, it's not the judge who asks the questions, it's the lawyers who ask the questions, and you refuse, they may say, in contempt of court, go to jail. The point is that still you could say we've consented because society has subscribed to certain kinds of information flows. So I don't know if you're willing to hand me that, but if we do, then we're not so far apart. Okay, anyway, that's what I'll say about your comments, but they were very rich.
Thanks so much for the talk and the response. I have a comment and then a question. And the comment is about when you were talking about the concern about collection and sort of the unease with collecting might just be bad on its face. I was thinking about the difference between a hoard of books and a library of books. The difference there is anyone who's seen the back end of the library donations will say it isn't about the order as much as the collection development policy. I was thinking about the legibility of how those books come to be in the library as sort of the defining difference rather than any sort of perception of order. And so I was thinking about the illegibility of the data hoard as being what is bad on its face versus the idea that data is being gathered
right, with some sort of purpose. In particular, there was that amazing NSA quote, the director of the NSA saying, we collect everything, our goal is to collect everything all of the time and hold on to it for as long as possible because we don't know. But that's a hoard of data, right? Like that's not a library of data. So it's thinking about that metaphor. And my question is more about the other news story that I was thinking of today in this talk is that horrible like tech bro in San Francisco who said he was offended by the homelessness in San Francisco. He's been living there for the length of period of time of 3 years, and this entitles him to understand how the decline of San Francisco, and, you know, these homeless people and saying, I shouldn't be forced to see the misery of people's lives in this beautiful city, you know, like that's actually what he says. And so I was thinking about, of course, Twitter goes nuts, and it's this like programmer, and so it evolved these phrases, right, about the tech bad boys and the programmers and these phrases. And it was making me think of like Lisa Nakamura's arguments about the way that we use the word trolls, and it sort of is under-theorizing the damage that these people can do. And so I was thinking about that same, so I wanted to ask that question about whether terms like bad boys or programmers or tech jerks, like whatever it is that phrase that we use is potentially under-theorizing what this ideology that seems so prevalent means for those of us who aren't programmers.
I'm not sure if I'm capturing everything you said. So the hoarding thing is really interesting in the NSA, because one of the other, in that little scheme that I showed, there's another project that I'm working on with one of our graduate students on data metadata distinction. And so we've been doing a lot of reading about that. And we're mindful of some of these claims. In fact, I started thinking to myself, maybe the first bad step we took was, I mean, it sounds unrelated, but with Gmail, when Google said, there's no human that's reading your email. We're just saving the email, and a machine is scanning the email to capture certain keywords so that we can produce the ads for you. And people just accepted that. The fact that no human was looking at it, but we're just collecting it, just in case, and then we're going to extract certain value from it. I didn't feel that we pushed on that argument hard enough. I say we as a community of academics or theorists or research, people who maybe think about technology agencies and so forth. So I think maybe that's what you were saying about the board. But the other point you're saying about using bad boy, and actually I have to say that I have colleagues who want to talk about creepiness. They'll say there's certain things that are just creepy. And they want to have a conference on creepiness. And I said, that's insulting. Because those of us who've been working for years and years trying to actually understand what the problem is, to just like put this term, creepiness, is really to devalue it. And I think that's what you were saying about in your second comment, which is the term bad boy. Well, just in my defense on that. The rest of the paper then tries to unpack that argument. And I use the word bad boy because there was a kind of bravado that those who uttered, let's say, the David Brin position, and this is as a little aside because you may know the book on obfuscation that just came out. David Brin gave it a scathing review, just FYI. So I felt like it was successful. but anyway, I agree with you, and that's definitely not the way we should end the discussion.
Yes. One thing that seems important to prevent consent is simple cognitive overload. Imagine if you got most judges in the world that the vast majority of them never read the terms and conditions, even though they might be in a unique position to actually understand them, simply because if you do so, you can't actually function. So I'm wondering, so the first part of my question is, I'm wondering whether it's even possible, really, I mean, along the lines of your water example, whether it's even possible to consent, given that we all have cognitive overload, and you couldn't read 8 pages of the terms and conditions, even if they could change on a dime anyway. And the second portion of the question is if, to the extent that you, to the extent that you can't give consent, but data can be collected quasi-legally or can be lost. Every year, you know, we have these massive security failures where large hordes of data are hacked into, and that's included government-private data, that's the government employee data, hospital and medical records. And so even if you said no, even if there's HIPAA, and the things that are supposed to protect data, it's not credible because essentially somebody can say, whoops, we lost your data. And once it's out there, it's gone.
So the key points, the one about consent, I mean, I think this is all grist for the mill. There are lots of different reasons why I think consent is not a good idea, and one of it has to do with the nature of information or the nature of data. And one of the arguments, among several that we offer in the end run paper, is to say that the reason I favor an information flow constraint approach to protecting privacy and basing that on the parameters, including things like the data subject being different from the sender of the data, is that oftentimes the data about you is not shared by you. It could be like if you're on Facebook, it could be a tagged photograph. It could be somebody wishing you happy birthday on an email. And you didn't agree that Google should know when your birthday is. But your friend wished you happy birthday on the day. So consent, and that's part of the end run. The fact that information about you can be gleaned in so many different ways, including from the big data point of view by situating you within a cluster of people who are like you, who have agreed, even though you have not. And so the recommendation I have, and that part of the paper is sort of unwritten because contextual integrity itself, although it offers greater power to do such things, still has some weaknesses that I can't think of how to overcome vis-a-vis big data, but I think you can get a lot further. On the issue of data breach, I mean, I agree with you. And one of the issues with data breach, it's precisely this cost-benefit. So some of the cost-benefit, those who are like descendants of the cost-benefit arguments, would say, we're not going to do cost-benefit on collection because we don't know in advance what the value of the data is. That's one of the big normative arguments. Let's do the cost-benefit on use. So we can still restrict, but we're going to do the cost-benefit on use. Now the problem is even that maneuver opens the subjects of the databases to greater threat. And I don't know that that's, we've given up doing the cost-benefit on collection. So, tough luck. Yeah.
So can you say more about what the costs are? Because I think part of the problem is it's very unclear to people what the danger is when they give up this information. They redo the terms on their phone and the sky doesn't fall, so they think it's fine, right? What are the real stakes for you in this issue? What are the dangers of giving up this kind of information?
I mean,
autonomy or a sense of creepiness or anything like that? What is the real danger?
So, I mean, you're asking an extremely broad question, which is fine. But I think I have to narrow it down, or maybe I'll ask you to narrow it down a little bit. Because you could be asking, the big question you could be asking is, what's the problem of losing privacy? What's the big deal? Is that what you're asking? Because there are people who will say, like, where's the harm, and then you go down that path to use restriction.
Can I jump in here? Because I think it's way easier to talk about the benefits, right? I think when you make this distinction that we should also think about regulating data collection, not only data use. As a researcher, I always think, yeah, you have all these unrestricted data, which is, I understand the risks and I agree with some of the things that you've said, but I can't help thinking, we have all the data in the world, you have to cope with that complexity, good luck, right? Sort of generating knowledge out of that data is difficult, but in the process, you have innovation, you have scientific development. And these are very specific good things about collecting all that data, right?
Right.
Assuming that everyone has good faith and everyone, has good people. I'm not sure who will. My fact, I don't know. But, so for me, I don't think Ashley's question was too broad. I think it's difficult to answer that question because I can think of very good benefits of collecting all the data. And it's not so clear to me what the drawbacks or the dangers are.
Right.
Although we can brainstorm about it. But, my reaction was I can name a few good things that come out of that, which is, and be more specific about it.
Right.
So I think it's not broad, it's just difficult to answer, and I think it's a fair question.
All right. So the reason I'm saying it's broad is that, first of all, I want to, and I mean, you included some very rich issues that are very much to the heart of the paper. So when we talk about costs, this is where you're kind of poking me to talk about the theory of contextual integrity. Because the way I envision privacy is about ensuring the appropriate flow of information. And that moment of collection is just one point along the way of the information flow. And to map the flow, you really have to specify all the different kind of stopping points and identify the parties and the nature of the information, and then the constraints under which, and that's where consent comes in as one case, like the constraint under which the information flows. Then, when you're trying to do the analysis of the legitimacy of any flow, so, take your click yes and the sky doesn't fall, you could think about all sorts of considerations as to, is this a good thing or not? Like, what is the problem? I click yes, nothing happens that I can recognize at that moment. And, I think humans are not very good at recognizing some of the long-term costs. So there are various long-term costs. Many people in the privacy area have been concerned with things like profiling and identity theft and some of these longer-term consequences of placing you in a cluster, which is discrimination and so forth. But something that contextual integrity is really attuned to, and this I learned from Priscilla Regan, who really got me into this, is to think about the social values that constraints on information flow achieve. And when we think about privacy, I really want us to think very broadly. I don't want to think about who's your boyfriend. Are you going to tell me or not? And if you do, what's the problem? I want to think about this as continuous with voting in a democratic election, and what the consequences are going to be, not only for you, but for the whole society. And so many people have talked about things like chilling. I was thinking about, killing myself when I get old. And I mean, not just old, but, if I got really sick and I was burdened and all of those things, I wanted to figure out how I'm going to kill myself in a way that's not too difficult. So I wanted to Google that. How do you kill someone painlessly? And then I'm thinking to myself, do I really want to do that? So that's just a small example, but chilling and so forth. So those are the kinds of things that we don't experience at the time. Anyway, but the benefits, I'm so happy they're hands, but I wanted to talk about the benefits a little bit because I think that there's a little bit of, what's the right word here? Equivocation. And that's also something I tried to bring it out in the paper because the costs and the benefits, who decides what the benefits are and who's paying the costs? And that's a common kind of question that critics of cost-benefit ask. So I'll just leave it there, that there's a lot more that can be said about that.
It's just pleased to say that it's not only the big companies that have, there's other, so we talk about privacy as if only Google and all these other companies were making a profit out of that data. There's a lot of health, it's good for knowledge.
Exactly.
And science and...
But I don't know what your profession is, but there are many people who, recently I attended a workshop given by the NIH, and they were asking this question, should we look at, it's possible that big data can help us with HIV, maybe identifying cases, encouraging people to come in for treatment, and people in danger of it and so forth. So we could utilize a whole much larger set of data. And this was an instance, and the people in the room were predominantly researchers, HIV researchers. That's where contextual integrity comes in and is really important, because the recipient of the data is a person who's characterized by a particular role in society with certain commitments. And so in those cases, the rules will be different. And I think the goals are much more compatible and so forth. Yeah.
Should take a moment before you go to the next question, if at any point there's anything you want to interrupt.
Yeah.
Okay. But go ahead.
I'll just go 1, 2, 3.
So I actually enjoyed the presentation in favor of those comments, but I want to help you push back a little bit more on the previous two. Because Ashley's comment and I don't know your name are both coming from a consequentialist perspective. I use my cell phone, the sky doesn't fall, why should I do it? Those are consequentialist frameworks. It seems to me you're approaching this from an ontological, maybe even teleological perspective, right? We have privacy is, you use the terms right and good, right? And maybe if you could come out stronger with the idea that, look, privacy is a good, it's, Chloe said, when I think of myself as data points, I feel less human, right? So there's and there's a notion of entitlement to rights. Someone mentioned, like medical HIPAA, right? Well, I don't know if any of you guys have doctors over a cup, but don't use my pen medicine because it gives you access to your records, but it gives other people access to your records, including every other single one of your doctors. And if you want to, one of your doctors and trash talk about the other one, that other guy's going to read it and destroy it. So the idea is you don't have a choice. And why does that bother us? And you're saying it should bother us because of who we are as human beings and what we're entitled to as human beings. And I think that's why you're focusing on the point of collection, because there's something, there's something fundamentally wrong about crossing these lines. And access, or user access, is all about consequences. It's all about consequentialism. And so I think maybe if you could use some of those philosophical categories to make clearer your framework, those questions become clearer. It becomes clearer why those questions are, in a sense, missing the point of what you're trying to argue.
Thank you for the additional ammunition. But I do want to be able to respond to the consequentialist in their own terms. So I want to be able to accept that argument. I want to be able to listen to the argument and explain in those very terms. Although I do, so like a really die-hard consequentialist might just do, overall, etc. But many philosophers struggle with how to take care of things like distribution. And I'm not sure that how many people are fundamentalist, consequentialist, or utilitarian who would argue that, enslaving 10% of the population so that 90% of the population live at a better quality, where if you do that, it comes out overall better. Maybe there are few people who would subscribe to that sort of thing. So I think I can still do the argument. But what you're saying gives me more ammunition, because the people who I want to influence, either in the policy realm or in the technology realm, are not going to be that sympathetic. So, but other people will. So thank you. Yeah.
You can also talk about the consequences of not feeling like a full and autonomous human. There might be a way to bridge the philosophical.
Right. And I think that in some of the voting kinds of arguments, where I would say democratic politics really assumes autonomy. And if we can't say, the reason we do the voting as we do is not only respecting, it's to say every individual shouldn't be coerced, blah, 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 but because we make an assumption that, it's governed by the people, for the people, and so on, so that we assume people are making autonomous choices. So, so I'm just agreeing with you and saying it plays out some ways in contextual integrity, where we say what kind of society do we want to be. If we want to be democratic, we have to ensure that people are making autonomous choices. Yeah.
So just off that, we'll go to a couple comments now, a couple of questions. But just off that, I think that I'm going to send you a paper that I just sort of finished that argues that the harm of privacy intrusions and these forms of collection resemble other kinds of status-creating mechanisms in society, such as segregation or various ways by which we delegate status in society. Right, and by intruding on someone's privacy, part of the discomfort that comes from just simply the intrusion and the collection is the act of delegation. So when the NSA surveils us, even if it doesn't use the information to do anything, part of it is that our relationship with the government feels altered in some ways because of that act of collection. And it's very similar to the mechanisms around that. The other comment is just a point of sorrow. Which I saw you cited in the paper. So what's interesting is that in sorrow, again, you see the distinction between use and collection collapse. Because the regulation issue in sorrow wasn't just about collection of information, but the regulation specifically mentions the word use of information of hands. So that's the questions that I want to ask were, to what extent, so if the distinction between collection and use is truly as ephemeral as you seem to suggest, and I think you're very convincing at various points, to what extent is your paper targeting a problem that's something more than nominal, right? Because if they're saying, well, we want to target use, and if use is not that different from collection depending on the context, then is there a problem with just targeting use? If they want to call it use, and ignore that it can also be called collection. Great, right? So that's one question. The other is, could you, so within the framework of contextual integrity, could you read the arguments being advanced by some of the proponents as claims regarding appropriate flow, right? So the idea that in a just society, these will be the appropriate norms of information flow. This is what we're trying to convince individuals to do. And that's that. That's what appropriate flow will be all about. And we're excellent contextual integrity. and then everyone's happy.
Let's see, I'm not sure I completely understood the question. There's the section in the paper where I'm trying to say, it's not clear to me how different proponents of this. So let me also clarify the position itself, because there are actually different versions of the position. Some would say, few people are saying people are saying that we should regulate use, and they're saying at that point where we're scrutinizing particular uses, we do some kind of evaluation and we come to a decision. And but at the point of collection, we're not going to try and impose any kinds of restrictions. So some of what I was sort of anxious about in regard to that was some people assume use is just that sweet moment of collection. That I've been teaching a course on big data at the moment, just actually trying to educate myself on the huge literature already, which is, and that term data is so crazy because the question is like, is data just there and people go and like sweep it up, put it into little bags and then you've got it, or is data kind of created and does it have to be recorded in order to be data and all of that. So setting aside all those metaphysical questions, collection for the PCAST report, the White House report, they seem to want to just limit it to that moment. But contextual integrity for contextual integrity, privacy is all about flow. So collection would be one point because it's one moment in the flow, but then there's lots of onward flow and data just moves around just crazily. So I think what I think you're saying is that and then of course there's use. So it could be that say a company collects the data and then sends you a coupon in the mail. That's the use. We're using the data to decide that we're going to send you the coupon and you don't get the coupon. So that's the use questions. There's no flow involved, but there's some decision, there's some prediction, there's something. But then there's this whole set of flow that PCAST wants to say is also use. If you are a company and you've got a big database and Axiom wants that and you decide you're going to sell to Axiom, is that use? And some people will say, yes, that's use and it should be regulated, but other people might just say, no, that's all part of the collection because Axiom is in the act of collecting the information. So that's why it's still kind of a hornet's nest, and what I think you're saying is that we can capture all of that with contextual integrity.
No, I think so. Actually, two distinct contextual integrity point is a separate point.
Okay.
The first point is, I think that maybe it would help to clarify what you think. I completely agree with the characterization of what use is and what collection is. I think that it would be useful to sort of characterize it, just to say, look, they're getting confused, and to say this is what use is and this is what collection is. And if you leave out collection, you're actually leaving out a whole bunch of stuff, right?
Yes.
But the contextual integrity point, and I don't think the contextual integrity point is really that so contextual integrity is regarding basically says that privacy is about keeping information within the norms of appropriate flow, right? And one could recast the argument of these of both the bad boys and others as saying that these are what either descriptively the norms are changing, or prescriptively the norms that guide contextual integrity should change, right? Either for consequentialist reasons or whatever else, right? Millennials are stupid, whatever, right? And if that's what they're saying, then it goes back to the critique, the original critiques of contextual integrity, is it just replication of the status quo is sufficiently innovative?
Right.
And so I'm wondering how we would address those things. Just say, you know, we are arguing for a just reform of information laws.
That's, I think, the direction of the solution space. No, it is. It's sort of to acknowledge that we're not going to just stop stop connection. But we, and there may be instances in light of some of the benefits that we're now anticipating that we might need to look beyond some of the restrictions that maybe 10 years ago we had in light of that, because contextual integrity does take those factors into consideration. All right, so
thank you so much for the talk. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on how much of this whole thing is about literacy and people being able to make informed decisions when they're signing up on terms of service forms and things like that. So Casey Kistler, she did her PhD looking at terms of service and how and if people actually understand those and become people. And how much of it do you think is a design/usability problem? What if we could design differently that people could actually understand what they're looking at and be able to make informed decisions about what data they are providing? And this is me acknowledging that even if we do that, then you would still, as a person, as a citizen, will have to just sign out of a lot of services if you're not comfortable with sharing your data, you know. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if my question is clear.
your question is clear, and my most extreme answer to you is that's impossible, that is just not confronting the problem, etc. Pragmatically, better privacy policies, and I'm really, Joe Turo loves to say, please don't call it a privacy policy, because actually you can say anything in that policy. You can say, I collect everything and I give it away to anyone who pays me money, and that could still be your privacy policy. So first of all, terms of use or whatever, maybe a little bit better. It might get people thinking. So from that point of view, it makes people aware. Just as the Snowden event got people to thinking about surveillance, and Tim Cook is getting people thinking about surveillance. But because, and if you're interested, you can read the article with Sola Carota. But I think that informed consent model is dead. It is not only dead, it is bad, because it allows companies to pretend that they're respecting your privacy, and they don't even know what's happening with the data. I spoke to General Counsel at the New York Times, and she was sort of distraught. She said they have to utilize these ad networks, and she has no idea what they're doing with the data. They feel that if they weren't going to do it, they would be leaving money on the table, and they're very stressed out and so forth. So even those in the business really are aware of it. And so the idea is to move to a model where we have substantive constraints. And I think, one of the, I wouldn't give up, so the comment you make about well, can you give up the use of the cell phone? And I think that you make it perfectly excellent argument to say that it's not really a free choice anymore. You cannot assume that you're going to live a successful and productive life if you do not subscribe to various things. So that, and I think that has to be scrutinized. But what I want to say is, why can't we have it and say no? It feels like we're put in this dilemma when in fact we don't have to be placed in that dilemma. And that's where I just keep pushing such a
constraint, even though I know that that's difficult and we're going to have a lot of argument about what the constraint should be and so forth. So, yeah.
So I want to push back a little bit from the point of view of social welfare systems where the kinds of technology that created the credit card industry still to a certain extent seem like a dream to somebody who's trying to apply for a food stamp or SNAP. Like that the amount of data you have to enter by hand, the amount of documents you have to collect in order to get every single individual benefit are just enormous. And it used to be that people who are trying to address that issue would say, well, why can't we make it easier for people who are eligible for these benefits to collect them? Can't we make this? It used to be that administrators always said, oh, the unions would never allow it. Now that they've more or less destroyed all the unions, they say, oh, it's those privacy advocates. They won't allow. And I feel like I see that happen in systems where you're in someone's school system, trying to figure out ways of better addressing the needs of children in school. So it's I feel in a lot of those, when you sit down with an administrator who wants to tell you no, that again, when they used to say, oh, it's the unions that won't let us do it, now they say, oh, right, HIPAA. And I just, I mean, you may say that's just I'm just interested in what
I accept the premise of what you're saying, but I feel it's a little bit like the argument of if we accept the technological advancement, we have to, there's some, I don't know what, necessity to accept the fact that there's no constraint on the information flows from that point onwards. And that's why I really enjoy my work with computer scientists, because it helps me understand the contingency of design. Systems can be built in a lot of different ways. And even the Apple, what we're seeing now with the Apple discussion, and I think your skepticism is, thank you, but nevertheless this question of do you encrypt or not. So there may have been a time where we say it's so convenient to use your credit card online. Sometimes the data in transit can be intercepted, but isn't it more convenient to pay online? And so you just have to take the chance that your credit card will be intercepted. And folks didn't like that. By the way, how lucky we were that we had, and I use this example in my paper, that a law had been passed that situated liability for such things in the hands of the credit card companies. Because we then got SSL. Now, of course, we know NSA, maybe there was a bug in it and all of that, but let's assume it worked. We then said, no, we don't accept this particular cost benefit. Maybe cost and benefit would still have won out. But we're not prepared to accept it, therefore we must insist on a design improvement. And so we got SSL. I did work on a big project on health information, and I don't know the technology very deeply, but I can say that there are ways of building these technologies that allow for greater expressiveness in the rules that constrain the flow from one point to another, or lesser, like you could have a cheap, I say cheap, I don't know if it costs less. Or you could just say, this is the flow and we're not putting any gatekeeping in that. But there is a growing body of work to enable you to have greater, really modulated constraints on the flows of the information. And so that's what I'm saying. So I don't think we should give up. I think we should insist that it's possible. But this is again where contextual integrity comes in, because the assumption is not that privacy is not about stopping the flow of information. It's about constraining the flow in these appropriate ways. And of course, what do we mean by appropriate? This is highly complex, and I don't have answers to most of the difficult cases, but area experts probably do. That's where I think the wisdom is going to come from there.
Now, I have a question. Listening to the concepts, it reminds me of human subjects research. And I do collect surveys, and I'm curious to see if the two literatures actually interact, because I hear a lot of the informed consent.
Yeah.
And for instance, if you ever design a survey, you know that informed consent, you have to inform the person that they can always opt out, and they can always terminate the survey whenever they want.
Right.
And so, also, in the human subjects literature, there is this real concern that it's not so much privacy, but it's in terms of confidentiality. The data is there, but what you cannot do is keep your identifiers. So there are ways so that they ask you to split the data, so you keep the personal identifiers. And so do these literatures cross? Is the human subjects a good model or not, or has been discarded or something?
So I like to bring that literature and say that is privacy, and the confidentiality is another instance of a transmission principle. When we discussed informed consent or notice of choice, actually we did reading in the human subjects area, because back in the day I used to teach research ethics classes. And it was very helpful to read that literature. And one of the things that we noticed, and again, part of it was an argument for contextual integrity, because what the current privacy regime does is that it situates informed consent as the gatekeeper. And then there's like some little bit of space remaining for certain kinds of substantive constraint. But in the way I understood the human subjects literature, and you can see if that's how you understand it, is that there are three commitments, and I'm like racking my brain. One is informed consent, one is beneficence, and what is the third one?
Coercion.
What?
Coercion. You cannot, you refer to coercion.
There's a risk-benefit for both the individual and society that's a big part of it.
Benevolence. Oh.
Okay. All right, thank you. So what that means is that you are committed to getting consent, but you're also committed to being a good guy.
Yeah.
Right? And that, so now if we look at that picture where it's like informed consent, now we're saying, actually there's a lot of stuff that you have to do as a researcher to ensure that the study that you're performing is beneficent.
Let me mention coercion, because for instance, if you cannot pay to a subject an unreasonable amount of money, because you're interviewing somebody who needs the money, you are coercing them to participate. So they put restrictions on what incentives you can. So it's so that's why I was thinking that, but I'm not so sure that it's completely applicable.
I think that goes to your point.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's completely applicable, and you can think about examples where you sign informed consents going to that they then in court they don't stand, because you go to the doctor, you're always signing that you might die.
Right. And the reason we sign it, the argument goes, is that we trust our doctor to, we trust that the doctor has done has sworn the Hippocratic oath and is not going to harm us and will act in our benefit. When we sign those forms, I would say that there's just very little there that's about consent, actually informed consent. more about trust of the institution. Yeah.
People have a right to costless anonymity, perhaps through tour.
To what?
A right to costless anonymity, perhaps through tour. Like, for example, this is an absurd example. If I go to the grocery store, I have a right to be private, but then I'm forced to pay twice as much for everything that I buy there unless I use their little card. So the only way I could enforce my rights to privacy, unless I'm very care about any costly thing, is basically through some form of anonymity.
I mean, that's where the devil is in the details. So, because we've worked so long with very, I think, oversimplified conceptions of privacy. I was going to say corrupted, but that was too extreme. Just things like control over information about myself or restriction of information flow, like secrecy. We've only looked at privacy like that. It's almost like when you open the gate a little bit, you're willing to accept, you have to accept the deluge. So in cases like the grocery, these loyalty cards, it may be that some connection of the data by the grocery store could be in everybody's best interests. But because we've opened the door to it and we have an overly simplistic notion of privacy, so we don't actually see all these other parameters for ways to constrain, we want to act anonymously because we don't believe that there's any endpoint once we say yes to the data going there. But imagine if we lived in a different kind of universe where we had studied these particular instances, and that's why it requires area experts. I'm going to just make something up because I have no idea about the retail environment. Or I'll say things about the healthcare environment because I have intuition, or about educational privacy because I have some instincts. But so this is completely hypothetical, but it could be that if we do the analysis, we all benefit from the store knowing more about its customers so that it can stock the right things on the shelves and so forth. So instituting some kind of program that enables flow benefits everybody, but we have constraints on what can happen to the data after that. So people like me who are paranoid about such things would also engage. So those constraints actually enable participation. Those are ways in which privacy can,
Why are you attached to the term privacy itself?
Yeah.
You are concerned about a variety of harmful consequences that can accompany systems of information collection and use without any sharp distinction between those. But you are concerned about a lot of different kinds of harmful consequences. And the term privacy does get you into this topic debate about what really is privacy and why we really value it. What value added does it give you as opposed to just say we should be very concerned about a whole range of harms of data collection and data use all along the flow?
So I would say, just give up the term privacy and let's just focus on contextual integrity. I mean, I was also regretful for that label because context is such a generic term and everybody thinks they can use it any which way they want to. And I want to say, no, that's terrible. Yeah, I mean, actually that thought has come to me, particularly with European colleagues who want to restrict the term privacy very much for personal autonomy. And then they'll say, what you really talk about, Helen, is data regulation or something like that. They don't actually see what I'm doing as privacy. And so I'm worried about that. One of the reasons I continue to use the term is because when I was looking around at, because what I wanted to do, I'm not an empirical social scientist, but so I was just casting about for anecdotal evidence of when did people freak out? When did we see these events emerge where people, how they frame is my privacy has been violated. And so it seemed to me to connect to those things and try and explain them. I kept the term privacy. But you know, if, I don't really need to attach to it except for that rhetorical reason. That's absolutely
Except that your point that you made in your talk about having this gut, my words now, feeling that the very act of collecting, regardless of whether it's going to be used, whether you're going to or not, feels like a violation. That feels to me like that is connected to the construct of privacy. So, you know, giving it up, I can see giving it up, but I think
I would miss that.
You have to use that. Yeah. I don't know if you want to or not, so that's an interesting piece of it.
Yeah. I don't know what time, there are a couple of hands, I don't know what time.
A little bit longer.
Oh,
You know, thinking about the earlier question that you said was too broad, it seems to me maybe a way to tweak that a little bit that gets to, I think, what the issue is that I have also, probably other people that have been speaking to with your paper, and that was when you speak of something like the appropriateness of information flow, it always seems like the appropriateness is sort of an ad hoc thing. We're going to solve that, you know, here in this way, we're going to solve it there in another way. We don't seem to have a kind of theory of where appropriateness comes from. You know, one can imagine a theory, you know, of privacy. Well, we know something about the theory of privacy. Growing up in democratic society, growing up in a situation where the state has too much ability to coerce citizens and we don't have public voice. You know, we have Habermas's ideal of a public sphere where dissent can take place, we can formulate new ideas outside the purview of the state. So privacy has a long history of theorization that might or might not be relevant to appropriateness, but it seems to me that you need something that is going to ground in a positive way, not simply an ad hoc way. You know, each time you have an argument to make against someone else's view.
Right. So, I don't think it's ad hoc. Appropriateness, I use the word because I want to tear people away from some of the received views. I like to look at the sphere of governance, political governance, because there our conceptions are quite sophisticated, and we have centuries of political philosophy or post-Enlightenment and democratic theorists and so forth who have developed these ideas on the relationship between a democratic or whatever good government and citizens. And so therefore that particular, now for me in the arena of contextual integrity, I'll say that's a context. And we have the particular actors, we have certain types of information and so forth, and that happens to be well fleshed out. When I look at the healthcare arena, that's also very inspiring to me, because you can go back to BCE, where you have Hippocrates, and one of the fundamental principles was confidentiality, or you could call it privacy. So we can learn a lot by those things. So when so that word appropriateness is really just a placeholder, and what it means for the theory is flow of information that's constrained according to a law, something like a social norm, and the social norm has a certain shape, and that's what the theory, that's the construct of the theory, that's what the theory of contextual integrity claims, but it's contextual, and we can look at some of these historically rich contexts and try and learn from them to say, and that's why the Fourth Amendment example that I used in the paper was sort of really interesting to me, in that I wanted to understand why do we have a Fourth Amendment? Why don't we just say let the police collect any which way, and then post fact figure out if it's doing any good? You know, if this information managed to catch the criminal, yes, then we're going to say that's okay. But no, we don't. We come in and we do this other thing. But I don't know, maybe the missing piece for you is the theory itself, which really does.
I think that's right. I think when you put in norm, of course, that raises a whole other set of issues about how that norm actually arises.
Right,
So that
exactly.
requires another body.
Well, I'll give you, this is again, it's an anecdotal story. I had a Japanese student, and I had, a number of years ago, we had some interactions with Japanese colleagues, and they said, you know, there isn't even a word privacy in Japan. It's just, what's that word we use? Like privacy or something like that. What's it called when you take an English word and then you transliteration or something. Anyway, they said no privacy in Japan because there's no word for it. So this student, the master student, we did I thought it was a really interesting project, and she went back to ancient Japanese texts. I said, forget about the word privacy, so it's sort of a little bit like that. And then you see things like modesty, when someone has to cover their face, when they can, what rooms you can enter, and it was a lot about social status and women and men and all of that, but there was, and any culture, most cultures I know of have rules against gossip and so forth, and you could have the word privacy or not, but you have those constraints on flow. So that's like the meat of what it is, and I think the term privacy, I mean, I have other theories about how it came about, but that's really what I'm trying to do. That's why social norms, because there's no presumption that the social norms we identify as privacy norms in the United States are the same as the social norms that we identify in Japan or India. They would all be privacy norms, but they would be different.
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
I had a question about when you're talking about personal autonomy. Where does the definition for that come from? Like, imagine a system that collects DNA samples upon birth and anonymizes them, and that's usually for good, like for social welfare. But then two different children grow up, and one's okay with that, but another one feels like that violates personal autonomy. Where does the definition come in?
Where does autonomy come into the privacy picture, or?
Well, where does the definition we work with of what's violating personal autonomy come in when we're talking about the privacy picture? Because it's something that can vary so much from person to person.
Right. I would not identify preference, just sort of basic preference with the exercise of autonomy. I'm a little bit on thin ice when I speak about this because the field of the study of autonomy is very rich, and I've done some reading about it, but there's a very strong relationship for the defense of privacy based on autonomy. And I think that I identify three ways, and then you can see whether this helps you with your problem. So one is that you need to be, that if you're deprived of the choice, privacy itself as control can be seen as an aspect of autonomy. That's one way, and maybe you're thinking about it in that way. But autonomy has also come into the privacy literature when we say that if we're placed under surveillance, then it's difficult for us and maybe impossible if the punishments are really great to act on our own principles. We need to act on whatever the conventional expectations are in society. And so there's excellent literature that shows that privacy promotes autonomy by enabling people certain zones of complete freedom. And so I would say in education, the freedom to choose what you want to read, what you want to study, what you want to discover, like intellectual, what your creativity, the development of creativity. This should be a zone of autonomy. And if we place people under scrutiny, we're going to diminish that. And then the third relationship between privacy and autonomy, and this is like a little bit convoluted, and that is that there's certain kinds of predictive modeling that may identify you as an easy mark for certain kinds of dissuasion. Actually, there's some of my colleagues are looking at this in the political domain of candidates profiling individuals and then pushing certain kinds of messages to certain constituencies and even down to the individual. So that kind of manipulation you could see as a diminishment of your autonomy. We're only going to present you this narrow band of information. And so we're trying to manipulate your action. So some would say, therefore, in order to protect you so that you come in, and I think Hannah Arendt had some conceptions of privacy where she suggests when we go out into the public, we are all the same. We mustn't be treated differently in that way. So that's a third relationship with privacy and autonomy. Robert Thompson.
Wanted to comment on that because I was going a little over on my time, so I skipped over a couple of things. But one of them was going to be a similar question, acknowledging that people have, autonomous individuals have different thresholds for privacy. Some people are sort of privacy exhibitionists, and some people are more moderate, and some people are libertarian, anti sort of infringement. And I was curious how contextual integrity as a general system can manage those different degrees. I think a consent-based system, even if it's not as robust as what I was originally projecting, has a way of, at least acknowledges that difference between people. And that's something that what you're getting at? Yeah. But you don't have to re-answer it now.
Well, I want to thank Helen. I want